They said no one ever said no to the Langston family. For generations, their name ruled the finance world, a dynasty wrapped in diamonds and whispers of untouchable power. But that illusion was about to shatter, all because of one woman. Amara Lewis had spent her life defying expectations. A self-made CEO, born to a single mother in a small Texas town, she now led Novalink Technologies, one of the fastest-growing companies in the world. And tonight she was walking straight into the heart of old money, the Langston estate, to seal a $1.2 billion partnership that would redefine the future of global tech. But what Amara didn't know was that this evening, before the chandeliers and champagne, before the cameras and polite laughter, her dignity would be tested in a way that would echo across the world. The black sedan came to a stop at the edge of the sprawling Langston property. Amara stepped out, her posture unshaken, her silver-gray suit sharp as steel. The night air smelled faintly of roses and rain. But beneath it all, there was tension, invisible and heavy. Inside the mansion, every surface gleamed, marble floors, gold-edged mirrors, portraits of pale-faced ancestors staring down from the walls as though guarding their legacy. Guests whispered as Amara entered, some out of curiosity, others out of disbelief. "Is that her?" one woman muttered behind her hand. "She doesn't look like a CEO." Amara heard it, of course. She always did. But she smiled anyway. The kind of calm, graceful smile that unsettles those who expect submission. She had learned long ago, the quieter the storm, the more it changes everything when it finally breaks. At the far end of the grand hall stood Daniel Langston, the heir to the family's empire, tall, confident, and smug in the way only privilege can teach. He raised his glass of champagne when he saw Amara and called out across the hall, his tone dripping with mockery. Did someone mix up the invite list? The catering staff usually enters through the back. A hush fell instantly. The laughter that followed was sharp, brittle, a sound that cut Amara like glass. Her heart clenched, but her face didn't move. She looked him dead in the eye and replied softly, "Then perhaps it's time you learned the difference between service and leadership." The guests froze. No one laughed now. Daniel's smirk faltered for just a second, just long enough for Amara to catch it. Then she turned away, her heels striking the marble with quiet defiance, and took her seat at the negotiation table beside Edward Langston, the family patriarch. Edward gave her a tight smile. "You'll have to excuse my son," he said. "He has yet to learn restraint." Amara replied coolly, "Restraint isn't the issue, Mr. Langston. Respect is." For the rest of the evening, the conversation moved like ice. Polite words, cold eyes. Deals and figures floated through the air, but underneath, a quiet battle was raging, not just between two corporations, but between dignity and arrogance. Later that night, after the formal dinner, Amara excused herself and walked alone through the garden outside. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the dark pond water. She had faced worse than Daniel Langston's cruelty before. Professors who doubted her, investors who ignored her, executives who called her too young or too bold. But this time was different. The insult wasn't just personal. It was a message, and Amara understood it perfectly. She looked back toward the glowing windows of the mansion and whispered under her breath, "You wanted to test my worth? I'll show you what true worth looks like." That night, the deal papers remained unsigned. By morning, the story was already spreading among the elite. Amara Lewis walked out of the Langston deal. No one knew why, but everyone wanted to. Back in her downtown penthouse, Amara sat at her desk, her phone buzzing nonstop with calls from her board members. They wanted answers, and fast. Her closest friend and COO, Nina Patel, finally burst into the room, her voice tense. "Amara, everyone's panicking. The Langstons are leaking stories that you overreacted. Investors are nervous. They think we can't afford to lose this deal." Amara's calm gaze didn't waver. "Then they'll soon learn that integrity is worth more than numbers." Nina sighed, rubbing her temples. "You're making enemies we can't afford." Amara leaned forward, her voice low and certain. Nina, the real enemies aren't the ones who insult you in public. They're the ones who make you believe you need their approval to survive. Nina fell silent. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the windows. Inside, Amara's phone buzzed again. This time, a message from the board chairman. Emergency meeting, 8 a.m. You need to explain yourself, she exhaled, looking out over the city skyline, the lights blurring in the storm. The fight had begun, and it wasn't about money anymore. The next morning, Amara entered the Novalink headquarters with a calmness that unsettled even her allies. Outside, reporters had already gathered, shouting questions about the broken billion-dollar deal. But Amara walked through them like a current through still water, steady, unstoppable. When she stepped into the boardroom, a dozen faces turned toward her, some angry, some afraid, all expectant. Henry Walsh, the board chairman, wasted no time. Amara, he began sharply, do you have any idea what's happening to our stock price? We're down 12% since dawn. I'm aware, Amara replied evenly, taking her seat. Henry slammed his palm on the table. Aware? You walked away from the biggest partnership this company has ever seen. You didn't just embarrass the Langstons. You embarrassed us. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Amara looked up, her tone steady but edged with steel. Henry, the Langstons embarrassed themselves. I just refused to play along. Nina watched from across the table, torn between admiration and fear. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Margaret Liu, another senior member, leaned forward, her voice sharp. Look, Amara, we're not here to discuss pride. This is business. You're letting your personal feelings cloud your judgment. Amara's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. Personal feelings? Margaret, respect is not personal. It's foundational. If we build partnerships on humiliation, what message does that send to every employee who looks up to us? Henry scoffed. Spare us the moral speech. The world runs on deals, not dignity. Amara's eyes hardened. Then the world is long overdue for a change. The room fell silent again. The ticking clock on the wall seemed suddenly deafening. Finally, Peter Gomez, the CFO, spoke up quietly. Amara, if we walk away from this, investors will panic. Layoffs might follow. Are you ready to bear that weight? She nodded slowly. Yes, because there are things heavier than numbers, and lighter to live with once you choose them. Her words hung in the air like the calm before a storm. Henry leaned back, his tone softening just enough to sound dangerous. Then you'll take full responsibility for this decision? I already have, Amara said. And I'll take responsibility for what happens next, too. There was a long pause. Then Henry turned to the rest of the board. Very well, record it. The CEO has unilaterally withdrawn from the Langston partnership. His tone carried the weight of judgment, but Amara didn't flinch. As the meeting ended, she gathered her papers and stood. Before leaving, she said quietly, We were founded on innovation. Maybe it's time we remember that innovation isn't only about technology, it's about courage. She walked out, leaving behind stunned silence. By afternoon, the headlines were everywhere. CEO cancels billion-dollar deal over insult. Integrity or instability? Market reacts to Novalink's shock decision, social media ignited with debate. Some called her brave, others called her reckless, but one truth spread faster than any opinion. Amara Lewis had stood up to one of the most powerful families in the country. That night, as Amara sat in her apartment, exhaustion began to settle in. The city lights shimmered through the rain, reflections scattering across the window pane. Her mind wouldn't rest. She thought of her mother, a nurse who worked double shifts and always said, The world might not respect you, Amara, but never give it permission to shame you. Amara smiled faintly through her fatigue. Her mother's words had always sounded like a warning. Now they felt like prophecy. Just then her phone buzzed again. Nina calling. Amara, I just got off another call with the board, Nina said breathlessly. They're under pressure from investors. They want you to reconsider. I expected that, Amara said. Please, Nina urged. Just meet with Edward Langston again. They're willing to issue a statement. Maybe even an apology. Private, of course. Amara leaned back in her chair, staring out at the storm. "Nina," she said softly. "An apology whispered in secret isn't repentance. It's damage control. Then what will you do?" Nina asked. Amara's answer came like a whisper of steel. "I'll remind them that respect isn't negotiable. Not even for $1 billion. She hung up. Outside, lightning cracked across the sky. Inside, Amara sat in the dark, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. Tired, but unbroken. In another part of the city, inside a towering glass skyscraper, Daniel Langston watched the same storm through his own office window. He was surrounded by advisors and lawyers, but none of them could silence the growing unease in his chest. His father's voice echoed from across the desk. "You've made a mess, Daniel. This isn't a PR issue. It's a disaster. She's become a symbol overnight." Daniel clenched his jaw. It was a joke. "People are overreacting." Edward's voice hardened. "That joke could cost us the empire." Daniel turned away, unable to face him. "She'll crawl back. They always do." But deep down, for the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't sure. As dawn broke the next day, Amara's assistant rushed into her office. "Ma'am, you need to see this." She handed Amara a tablet. On it, a shaky video, filmed on someone's phone inside the Langston mansion. Daniel's voice echoed through the speakers. "Did someone mix up the invite list? The catering staff usually enters through the back." And there it was. Every sneer, every smirk, captured for the world to see. Within hours, the clip exploded across the internet. Hashtags like dignity over deals and respect eyes power trended globally. For Amara, the truth was finally visible. For Daniel Langston, the reckoning had begun. By the next morning, the world had already chosen its side. The video of Daniel Langston's cruel remark had spread like wildfire, from business channels to college campuses, from social media feeds to nightly news broadcasts. People were outraged. Hashtags like "Stand with Amara" and "No Deal Without Respect" dominated every platform. And with each passing hour, the Langston Empire's stock value dropped further. In one viral comment, a user wrote, "She didn't lose a deal. She gained the world's respect." Amara scrolled through the messages, reading thousands of voices echoing the same sentiment. She didn't smile, not out of pride, but out of clarity. The truth was finally out, and it had spoken louder than money ever could. Nina entered her office, eyes wide with disbelief. "Amara, this is unbelievable. Every major outlet is covering your story. You're being called the face of ethical leadership." Amara looked up calmly. "It's not about me, Nina. It's about what people have been waiting to see. Someone finally saying no." Nina handed her a stack of printed emails. "These are partnership offers. Sterling Dynamics, Orion Systems, even Titan Holdings all want to work with us. They're calling you a pioneer." Amara flipped through the letters. "Not a pioneer," she said quietly. "Just someone who remembered what integrity feels like." Meanwhile, inside the Langston skyscraper, chaos had become the new routine. Investors were furious, brands were cutting ties, and in boardrooms once filled with quiet confidence, panic ruled. Edward Langston stood by the window, his usual calm replaced by visible strain. He turned to his son, who sat slumped in a chair, staring blankly at his phone screen. "Daniel," Edward said coldly, "our shares have dropped 20% in 2 days. Sponsors are threatening to pull out. You've humiliated this family," Daniel muttered. "It's just online noise." "It'll fade," Edward's patience snapped. "No, it won't fade. You made a woman's dignity a spectacle, and the world saw it." "That doesn't fade, Daniel." "That brands you." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. The arrogance that once colored his tone was gone, replaced by confusion, and something new he couldn't name. Fear. He looked at his father. "So what do we do now?" Edward's reply was like ice. "We face the consequences." Back at Novalink, the air was charged. Every employee, every journalist, every partner waiting for Amara's next move. That afternoon, she held a press conference. The hall was filled beyond capacity. Cameras clicked endlessly as Amara stepped up to the microphone in a simple white suit, her voice steady and calm. I've been asked if I regret walking away from a billion-dollar deal, she began. The answer is simple. No. I regret that we still live in a world where respect must be debated at all. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I didn't end that deal because I was angry, she continued. I ended it because I refused to build success on someone else's prejudice. My dignity, my team's dignity, is not for sale. A young reporter stood up, voice trembling slightly. Ms. Lewis, what would you say to those who think this was an emotional decision, that business requires compromise? Amara met her gaze directly. If integrity is a weakness, then the world needs more weak people. The room erupted with applause. As the press conference continued, Amara answered every question with clarity and grace. She didn't attack anyone by name. She didn't gloat. She simply spoke truth, and that truth spread faster than any scandal ever could. By evening, the footage of her speech had already gone viral. Her words, "Respect is not for sale," were quoted in headlines across the globe. For millions, she became more than a CEO. She became a symbol of quiet defiance and unshakable dignity. That night, as the world celebrated Amara's courage, the Langston estate sat in darkness. Daniel watched the news alone, every headline cutting deeper than the last. He saw Amara's calm face on every screen and hated her for it. But beneath the hatred, there was something worse. A realization that terrified him. She wasn't just winning the public. She was changing it. Who does she think she is? He muttered bitterly. She's ruining everything. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. She wasn't ruining anything. She was revealing what had already been rotten. Moments later, Edward entered his study, face lined with exhaustion. Daniel, the board has voted. You're suspended from all executive duties effective immediately. Daniel's eyes widened. You're joking. Edward shook his head. You've brought shame to our name. The only way forward is accountability. Daniel stood abruptly. You can't just take everything from me. His father's tone turned quiet, final. You took it from yourself. For the first time, Daniel had no words. Across town, Amara sat by her window, city lights reflecting in her eyes. She wasn't celebrating. She was thinking about power, perception, and the cost of doing what's right. Nina entered softly. You okay? Amara smiled faintly. I'm fine, just processing. Nina hesitated, then said, You know, Amara, people keep calling you a hero. Amara looked out at the skyline. Heroes are made when the world forgets how to act human. I just remembered. Nina didn't reply. She just sat beside her friend as thunder rumbled in the distance, the sound of change still echoing. But this was only the beginning. Over the next few days, protests erupted outside the Langston headquarters. Crowds chanted, Respect has no price, and dignity over dollars. Media analysts called it the moral turning point of the decade. Business schools held impromptu panels to discuss Amara's decision. And for the first time, people began to ask out loud, what is the real cost of success? While the Langstons scrambled to contain the damage, Novalink's shares rebounded, stronger than ever. Amara's refusal to bow had become a movement, and as she sat in her office one evening, reading yet another flood of messages from strangers thanking her, she whispered quietly to herself, This isn't victory, it's responsibility. Weeks passed, but the storm Amara had stirred showed no sign of fading. It had grown, sweeping through cities, boardrooms, and classrooms across the world. Her story wasn't just trending anymore. It was transforming people. Young professionals began sharing their own experiences of disrespect, bias, and moral compromise under the tag, the Amara effect. It wasn't about race or gender alone. It was about the universal hunger for dignity. And at the center of it all stood Amara Lewis, calm, composed, and quietly relentless. Novalink's offices overflowed with new opportunities. Major corporations that once ignored her company now fought for her partnership. In less than a month, Novalink signed 4 new alliances, each more lucrative than the Langston deal ever was. Nina entered Amara's office one morning, holding a tablet with a grin she couldn't hide. Amara, you're not going to believe this. Novalink's valuation just tripled. Amara looked up from her papers. Tripled? Yes, Nina said. And every single one of these companies mentioned one reason for joining us. Integrity. Amara smiled faintly, though her tone stayed humble. Integrity shouldn't be a business strategy, Nina. It should be the standard. But deep down, even she knew something had changed. The world had finally started to listen. Meanwhile, across town, in what had once been the proud Langston Tower, silence reigned. Half the staff had resigned. Sponsors had withdrawn. The family's reputation, once seen as indestructible, now hung by a thread. Daniel sat alone in his office, staring at a stack of newspaper headlines piled on his desk. Each one carried a different blow. Langston Empire faces collapse. Investors withdraw after racism scandal. Public trust at all-time low. Every word was a reminder, not just of what he had lost, but of what he had never truly valued. His father entered quietly, the fatigue in his eyes deepening with each passing day. Daniel, the board is demanding an apology. Public, complete, no conditions. Daniel's jaw tightened. You mean humiliation? Edward's tone was cold. You call it humiliation. I call it accountability. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing. She destroyed everything. No, Edward snapped. You destroyed yourself. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, Daniel saw his father not as a shield, but as a man broken by shame. Edward turned to leave, but stopped at the door. Apologize, Daniel. Not for me. For yourself. Before there's nothing left to save. Across the city, Amara sat in a meeting when her phone buzzed. Nina leaned over and whispered, You've been invited to speak at the Global Leadership Summit in Geneva. Amara blinked in surprise. The summit? Nina nodded. Theme of the year, the true cost of success. They want you as the keynote speaker? Amara leaned back in her chair, exhaling softly. It seems the world wants to hear what it once tried to silence. A few weeks later, Amara stood on a vast stage before thousands of global leaders, entrepreneurs, and activists. The lights dimmed as she stepped forward in a simple ivory suit, her voice steady but filled with warmth. When I walked away from that billion-dollar deal, she began, people told me I'd ruin my future. But what kind of future is worth having if you lose yourself to get it? Every eye in the room was fixed on her. True success, she continued, is not the number in your account. It's the peace you feel when you look in the mirror. Because no matter how high you climb, if you've trampled respect along the way, you've already fallen. A deep silence settled across the auditorium. Not emptiness, but reverence. Amara looked out over the crowd, her tone softening. Dignity isn't something anyone can give you. It's something you protect, every day. Against fear, against greed, against pride. The audience rose to their feet, applauding not with noise but with genuine admiration. Her speech, recorded live, would go on to be shared millions of times within hours. The cost of dignity became a global conversation, inspiring marches, essays, and classroom debates. Back home, Daniel watched her speech on a massive screen in his darkened office. Every word she spoke felt like it was aimed straight at him, he whispered bitterly. She's turned me into a lesson. But even as he said it, the truth weighed on him. She hadn't destroyed him. His arrogance had. His father entered quietly, placing a folder on the desk. The press conference is tomorrow. Don't waste this chance to begin again. Daniel looked at the folder but didn't touch it. And if I can't fix it? Edward sighed. Then at least you'll know you tried. Redemption doesn't rebuild wealth. It rebuilds worth. For a long moment, neither man spoke. And in that silence, Daniel finally understood what he had lost. Not a company, not his fortune, but his humanity. Meanwhile, Amara's life moved forward in quiet grace. She refused most interviews. She declined every award dinner. Instead, she focused on Novalink's expansion and a new initiative offering mentorships for underrepresented youth in tech. When a journalist asked her why she stayed out of the spotlight, Amara simply said, I don't need to be seen to make an impact. I just need to stay true. Her humility made people love her even more, and while Amara was building bridges, Daniel was watching his crumble. He attended the press conference his father arranged. For the first time in his life, his voice trembled. "I was wrong," he said before a wall of cameras. Not just in words, but in heart. "I've learned that no empire can stand on the foundation of disrespect." Some doubted his sincerity. Others believed he was finally learning. But whether or not the world forgave him, one truth remained. He had learned through ruin what Amara had known all along, that power without empathy is hollow. That night, after the conference aired, Amara received a single message on her phone. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I understand now. Thank you for teaching me what no one else ever did." Daniel L. Amara stared at it for a long time. Then she typed a single reply. "Growth begins where excuses end." And with that, she set her phone down and closed her eyes. A quiet peace washing over her. The war was over, not between two people, but between pride and principle. A full year passed since that stormy night when Amara Lewis had walked out of the Langston mansion. What began as one woman's quiet act of defiance had transformed into something far larger, a shift in how the world defined success itself. Across continents, business schools began teaching a new case study, the Nova Link principle. When integrity becomes power, her words, "respect is not for sale," had become etched into classrooms, corporate ethics handbooks, and social movements around the world. But Amara herself had not changed. She still arrived early to her office. She still brewed her own coffee. She still stopped by the engineer's floor to ask how they were doing. When people praised her, she always said the same thing. "I didn't start a movement. I just remembered who I was." Meanwhile, the Langston name had nearly vanished from the headlines, replaced by newer stories, newer scandals, newer heroes. But in the quiet corners of the world, Daniel Langston was rebuilding, piece by piece. He had sold his sports cars, closed his penthouse, and started working anonymously with a non-profit that helped underprivileged students access education. The world might never love him again, but he had finally stopped trying to be loved. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Daniel met his father at a small cafe, the first time they'd spoken in months. Edward looked older now, his once impenetrable presence softened by humility. "How's the new work?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Hard, but real," Edward nodded slowly. "That's what work was meant to be." Daniel hesitated, then said quietly, "You were right, Father. I thought power made me untouchable." "I was wrong." "It made me blind." Edward's voice was gentle for the first time in years. "And sight, Daniel. That's the one thing power can't buy." They sat in silence for a while, not as a dynasty, but as two men learning how to be human again. Across town, Amara stood backstage at the Global Values Forum, where she was being honored with the Humanitarian Leadership Award. The applause was thunderous as her name was announced, but when she stepped up to the podium, she didn't speak about her achievements, her wealth, or even her influence. She spoke about something simpler, something timeless. "There was a time," she began, "when I thought success meant arriving at the top. But the truth is, it means standing tall, even when you're standing alone." The audience grew silent. "I learned that respect doesn't come from others. It comes from the choices we make when no one's watching. Dignity is the quiet voice inside that says, I can start over without shame, because I didn't betray myself." She paused, letting the words settle like gentle rain. "In every era, there will be people who mistake kindness for weakness or ethics for emotion. But the strongest thing we can ever do is refuse to trade our humanity for power." The hall erupted in applause, a roar that seemed to shake the very walls. But Amara only smiled softly, her eyes shimmering with calm gratitude. Later that evening, after the event, Amara walked outside into the cool night air. She stood on the steps, looking out at the skyline, that same city that once doubted her, now glittering with possibility. Nina joined her, a gentle smile on her face. "Do you ever miss the quiet life?" she asked. Amara laughed softly. "Every day. But if the noise helps others find their voice, then it's worth it." Nina nodded. "You've changed so many lives, Amara." Amara shook her head. "No, Nina, they changed themselves." "I just reminded them they could." A moment of silence passed between them, peaceful, proud, complete. A few days later, a handwritten letter arrived at Novalink's headquarters. It had no company logo, no grand signature, only a simple envelope bearing the initials DL. Inside, the message read, "Amara, I won't ask for forgiveness, but your courage forced me to see what I had become. I'm working to rebuild, not my name but my character. Thank you for lighting the path, even for those of us who once walked in darkness." Amara read the note quietly, her expression unreadable at first. Then she folded it neatly and placed it in her drawer beside an old photograph of her mother, the one who had always said, "Never let anyone make you small," she whispered. "I didn't, Mama, and neither will they." Years later, when people spoke of Amara Lewis, they didn't talk about her wealth or her company's empire. They spoke of the night she walked away, and everything she stood for since. They said her name like a reminder that one act of courage can undo centuries of arrogance, that one voice of dignity can silence the loudest cruelty, and that one woman, standing tall, can make the world remember what it means to be human. Amara often ended her speeches with the same words, a message not just to CEOs and leaders, but to anyone listening. We can't control how others treat us, but we can always control how we respond. The real measure of success isn't how much you gain, it's how much self-respect you keep. The audience would always rise to their feet, not out of habit, but out of shared truth, because deep down everyone knew she was right. And long after the applause faded, after the lights dimmed and the cameras turned away, the echo of her words lived on, not as a headline, but as a heartbeat. Dignity, integrity, humanity, the three things no amount of wealth could ever buy, and the three things Amara Lewis proved the world could never take away. The end.